Thank you, thank you, thank you. I asked to be introduced as apostle, prophet, bishop. So, anyway. But it was mentioned a little while ago that Jan and I, my wife and I, are taking another tour to Israel. So I want you to write this down. I want you to join us. Because as you know, Simon was saying, he and Ashley came with us a few months ago, and we literally did go to where Gideon was, and we're going to go everywhere. So here are the dates. April 23rd to May 4th of 2023. It's after Easter. April 23rd to May 4th. It will be the cheapest trip to Israel and Jordan. We're going. Israel and Jordan. So we're going to go to Petra as well, which was life-changing. Petra is the most incredible experience you're going to have. A city carved out of the mountain. It's amazing. So we're going to go to Israel and Jordan. If you want to know more about it, just Google my name, Darin Latham, Israel 2023, and you'll go to a site there, and it'll give you all the information, all the facts and figures and so on. Also, there's some brochures around the building a bit, and check it out. Join with Jan and I as we will travel in some buses together and travel throughout Israel. It's going to be the adventure of a lifetime. Trust me on this. You'll never read the Bible the same again afterwards. So I hope as many as possible can join us for Israel 2023. All right. We're going to begin today at the beginning, which is always a good place to begin, right? We're going to begin today at the beginning because what we're going to do is we're going to start today by sort of tapping into a leadership root here at Broadway Church. We're going to begin by answering a really foundational question. And that question is this: why do we do things the way that we do them here at Broadway Church? Why do we do things the way we do them here at Broadway? Now, Broadway Church has a unique brand, a unique style. If you've been to other congregations, you know that there's some things we do here that are a little unique, and you might wonder, why do we do things the way that we do them? I love the story about the young bride, and she just married, and she was cooking her first roast for her husband. And as she was preparing the roast, she cut the end off the roast before putting in the roasting pan. And she thought to herself as she's cutting the end of the roast off, why am I doing this? Why am I cutting the end of the roast off? And then she thought, that's what my mother taught me. She taught me to do that. Why did my mother teach me to do this? So she picks up her phone, she calls her mom. She says, Mom, I'm cooking my first roast as a newly married woman, and you know something? I just cut the end off the roast, and I thought, why did I do that? And I realized I do that because you taught me to do that. Why did you teach me to cut the end off the roast? And the mother said, I have no idea. She says, actually, my mother taught me that. She said, I'll call Grandma right now and I'll find out why she taught me to do that. So she hangs up from talking to her daughter. She calls her mother, the daughter's grandmother. And she says, Mom, my daughter just called me and was making a roast, and she cut the end off the roast, said, why do I do that? And she realized I taught her to do that. And I told her, you taught me to do that. Why did you teach me to cut the end off the roast? And the grandmother said, that's because our roasting pan was too small. So sometimes until you dig in and get to the root, you really don't know why people are doing things the way they're doing them. Why do we uniquely do things at Broadway Church the way that we uniquely do them? Now, you need to know that our brand, our style, our flavor of ministry at Broadway Church is not an accident. It was all designed. It was all intentional. In fact, I could say this, dare say there's not one thing we do here that doesn't have a philosophical reason behind it. We are seriously and sincerely that intentional in how we do ministry here at Broadway Church. Every single thing we do at Broadway has a reason behind it. And you need to know that how we do everything that we do here can be traced back to a philosophical foundation of ministry. A foundation of a philosophy of ministry, let me put it that way. A philosophy of ministry that God gave to me literally the moment I became a follower of Jesus at 19 years of age. And a philosophy of ministry that has evolved over the decades that I've been pastoring, and a philosophy of ministry that I shared with the search committee and the board and the congregation of Broadway Church when they were interviewing me about whether or not I would come and be the pastor here 15 years ago. You say, so what is this philosophy of ministry? Well, it actually was rooted in my call to ministry. I became a follower of Jesus at the age of 19 when I sat down, because I just sensed a stirring in my life for reasons I won't get into, and I felt like God wanted to speak to me. And I had a Sunday school teacher, her name was Jean Barkley. She was my Sunday school teacher when I was a little boy, and she said, Darin, if you're ever in trouble and you need God to speak to you, just open the Bible, start reading, and he'll talk to you. Now, I wouldn't necessarily give that advice to anybody today, but as a young boy, 12 years of age, I tucked that away in my brain, and I thought, well, that's fascinating. And then I went away from the church for the next 7-8 years. But then, in a crisis in my life, I remembered the advice of my Sunday school teacher. And so I looked through my home at that time to find a Bible. And I found one. And actually, this is the actual Bible that I found. An old Gideon's, or it's a hardcover Revised Standard Version that was awarded to my sister from the Baptist church we attended as kids on September 14th, 1969. So this was sitting around our house. And so as a kid, I found this, and I just said, okay, God, if you exist, I'm asking you to speak to me. And I opened the Bible to Jeremiah chapter 1, these exact words. And I started to read this. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations, an apostle and bishop. I'm just kidding. And then I said, Lord God, behold, I don't know how to speak, for I'm only a youth. But the Lord said to me, do not say I'm only a youth, for to all to whom I send you, you will go, and whatever I command you, you will speak. But don't be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. And then the Lord put forth his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, behold, I have put my words in your mouth. See, I have set you this day over nations and kingdoms. And here's the key. To pluck up and to break down. Now, it's different in the NIV. To pluck up and to break down. To destroy and overthrow, and to build and to plant. I put the Bible down. I went out to my mother and father, who were not following Christ, and I said, Mom and Dad, I think God wants me to be a minister, a pastor. And I never really looked back after that moment. But here's the thing. As I then went to school for the next several years and then became a pastor, those words, to uproot and to tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant, those words have become the theme of my ministry. God, throughout my life as pastoring, has sent me into congregations that were in crisis, that were at a crossroads, that were in conflict, and my ministry has been to uproot, to tear down, to destroy, to overthrow, to build and to plant, to go into congregations that were needing direction, and to do these things, to rip up some old stuff and to replant and rebuild. And every church that I went to, as I look back over the decades, prepared me for the next church. One church that I pastored in Cambridge, Ontario, prepared me for the next church, which was in Chilliwack. And that was a little bit of a bigger challenge, which prepared me for Central and St. Catharines, which then prepared me for the ultimate challenge, which was Broadway Church. And I shared that, and the leadership of Broadway Church knew of my ministry, or knew of the theme of my ministry, and so when they contacted me, we talked about that, and some of the search committee are here today, so they know what I'm talking about. And in the interview process, we talked about what I do, and how I would bring change, and things would be different, and so on, and I talked quite openly. I remember weeping with them and saying, we can't make a mistake here. I said, I don't want to bring my family across the country if God's not in this, and I don't want you folks to bring me here and me mess things up if God's not in this. We need to know together that God is in this. So you say, so what is this ministry philosophy that stands behind what we do here? Well, let me tell you, my philosophy of ministry that kind of overarches what we do here now and have been doing for the last 15 years roughly, I can tell you the moment it formed in my mind. I can tell you where I was sitting, what I was doing, the moment it literally occurred to me. I'd been the lead pastor of a church in Cambridge, Ontario for about 2 years, a year and a half. And what we did then was we decided as a staff, let's have a friend day. We called it a friend day. We said, we advertised for a couple months beforehand to our congregation. We said, on a certain Sunday in a month or two, we are going to have a service called Friend Day. We're encouraging you to invite your friends to come on that Sunday. And we said, everything that happens in the service will be designed to reach your friend for Jesus. And we'll have a fellowship afterwards. It's all designed for you to bring a friend. And on that Sunday, know that the gospel will be preached, and it'll all be designed with your friend in mind. A special day called Friend Day. Now, we do that every Sunday now here at Broadway. But back then we thought, let's think about lost people. And let's design our services with lost people in mind. That's a novel idea. So we did that. And we advertised it, we encouraged people, we prayed over it. And on that Sunday, the place was packed. And people brought friends. And I preached the salvation message. And about 45 to 50 people came forward to accept Christ that Sunday. I'd never seen anything like it before in my life. And in all sincerity, on a typical Sunday, I've not seen anything like it since. It was an incredible moment. And as part of that crowd that came forward at the end of that service was a couple, Al and Cora Fritzley. Now, I'd never met them before. And I didn't know who they were at that moment. They were just faces to me at that moment. But some people in our congregation had invited them. Their children played hockey together. They spent a lot of time at the arenas together. They invited Al and Cora, and Al and Cora came. Cora was a chartered professional accountant. Al was a manager at a local car dealer in that city of Cambridge, about an hour outside of Toronto. And they came forward, and they started then to attend that church, Calvary Assembly, every Sunday for the next 6 weeks or so. I'm sitting and I still hadn't met them. I'm sitting in my office one day, about 6 weeks later, and I get a call on my office phone. And I say, hello. And she said, yes, Pastor Darin, this is Cora Fritzley. She said, you don't know us, but we're about to get baptized at Calvary. I said, oh, yes, Cora, I've heard about you. And she said, yes, Al and I have been attending, and we're, have lots of questions, and we're really inspired. She said, but I have a question to ask you. And she said, but it's a stupid question. I said, Cora, there's no such thing as a stupid question. What's your question? She said, who's the lamb? I said, I beg your pardon? She said, we've been singing every Sunday, worthy is the Lamb. Who's the Lamb? And at that moment, my life changed. I was sitting in my office chair. I spun around in my chair, looked out the window from my office over to the parking lot, and it occurred to me, I've been preaching to the choir. I've been talking to people like they know better. Like they know the Bible, and they don't. I've made this huge assumption that everybody out there knows better. They're just backslidden. They were raised in the church. They're aware of the Bible, and they know all the terminology, and they just come now, and we kind of give them a little jump start to keep them going again. And I realized that's not true. Who's the Lamb? Cora and Al were raised in Cambridge, Ontario. Born, bred, raised, professional in the heartland of Canada. And they had no idea who was the Lamb. And so began a journey for me in ministry. I began to rethink everything I did as a lead pastor and how we did everything as a congregation. And I had to ask myself, how did a man and woman raised in the Canadian heartland have no understanding whatsoever of God or the Bible? And so I began a journey of investigation. And here's what I discovered. There's different, of course, generations. The oldest generation alive today is what we'll call the elder generation, or the greatest generation. This is the generation who went through World War II. Anyone born before 1946, you're in the elder generation, per se. And so this generation, they went off to war. They were raised in a Christian nation in the sense that the elder generation, well, back in 1946, here's a stat for you. Back in 1946, 67% of Canadians went to a church every Sunday. In 1946, 67% of Canadians were in a church every Sunday. Not once every 2 weeks, not once a month, every Sunday. Okay? In 2020, 11% of Canadians attend a weekly service of any religious gathering. In 2020, only 11% of Canadians go to any religious service of any kind. In 2020, 50%, one half of Canadians check off no religion on their census. Half of Canadians are either agnostic, atheist, or no religion. In the year 2020, 6% of Canadians attend an evangelical church. How did this happen? That elder generation, raised in the church, attending church every Sunday. Johnny goes off to war in their early 40s. And so, he goes off to war as a single man, and then he comes home. Maybe he got married just before he went to the war and went off to Europe, or maybe he waited till he came back from the war and they get married. But regardless, let's say Johnny and Martha, they get married just before he goes off to war, which is what many did. Then he comes home in 1946 from the war. He's not seen his wife for a couple years. She meets him at the train station. They go home and they played Monopoly. That's not what they did. They went home, and 9 months later, Johnny Jr. and Martha Jr. are born. And that happened all over North America. And it began what generationally been known as the baby boom generation. It's because there is a boom of babies, an explosion of babies from 1946 to 1966 in Canada. It's called, statistically, they call it the pig and the python, because when you graph it, the statistics for babies were doing this, and then there's this, and then it does this. There's this hump like a pig swallowed by a python. The baby boom generation. This is a generation like no other generation. I'm part of that generation. I'm born in 1962, so I'm at the end of the baby boom generation. And with this generation, all previous generations were kind of swallowed up by the generation before because the numbers were roughly the same, and so the next generation would kind of follow along the previous generation. But the baby boomers were like no one else. Their sheer weight, their sheer numbers changed everything. And it was the marketing people who were on the edge of societal evolution who caught this first. And as I've read and studied, it really happened with the raccoon skin cap of Davy Crockett. So what used to be was advertisers would advertise to the parents because the parents had the money in their wallets. But what they discovered was when they started to advertise to the kids, they had an explosion. They targeted children with these Davy Crockett raccoon skin caps, and they just exploded in sales. And they realized, hold on, we shouldn't market to the parents because they have the wallet in their pockets. We should market to the kids because they have their parents' heart in their hands. And so they did. And so this boomer generation suddenly became this huge target. And the baby boom generation began to learn whatever we want, we get. And we've got power, and we have influence. And the older they got, the more arrogant, confident they got. And they changed everything, music, everything, culture. And most of it not for the better, truth be told. And I say that as a baby boomer. But here's what happened. So the baby boom generation, as they're younger, they're going to church, they're taken to church just like their parents. 67% of them are in church every Sunday. But then as the boomers grew to teens, the baby boomers started to say, we don't like what you're doing in church, and the music's irrelevant, and what you're saying is not relevant. You're not talking about things where we're living. can we adjust and change things? And the previous generation said, no. We've always done it this way, and we're going to continue doing it this way. And the boomers said, well, if you do that, we'll leave. And they said, the older generation said, well, you can leave if you want. We're not budging, but you'll be back. And the boomers left. And they didn't come back. And then they raised their children, the Gen X, outside of church. And for the first time, now get this, folks, this is huge. For the first time in Western civilization, a generation was raised completely outside of church. For the first time in Western civilization, a generation was raised biblically illiterate. And then the Gen X had children, and they were raised outside of the church. And then they had children raised outside of the church. Until today, you've got half Canadians say, I have no religion. 6% of Canadians say, I go to an evangelical church, meaning a church where the gospel is preached. And this is the world you and I live in. And these are the people you and I are called to reach. And I can't treat them like they know better. They don't know better. Who's the lamb? You've heard me tell the story, perhaps. I do a teaching on historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And I was invited to a local university a couple years ago at Easter time to share the evidence for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. And I began my talk at this event that I was invited to speak at. And I said, it's Easter, and so I've been invited to come here today to talk about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And then I made my presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, as I always do, I opened it up for questions. So any questions? And a gentleman, I'll never forget, first one, over to my left, he raised his hand, he said, yeah, I have a question. I said, what's your question? He says, you began your talk by saying that it was Easter, and so you were invited to come to talk about the resurrection of Jesus. I said, yes. He said, my question is this: what does Jesus have to do with Easter? And at first I thought, is this a joke? Like, is this a setup? But I've learned never to assume that, and so I said, I answered the question. Then afterwards, they had sort of a coffee time, and I made a beeline for this gentleman. And I went to him afterwards. I said, I appreciate your question. I said, so tell me a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? He said, born and raised here in North Van. Born and raised in North Vancouver. University student. And he asked the question, what does Jesus have to do with Easter? This is our world. There's a picture I want to show you. A famous picture that I've used as a metaphor for many years now. I've shown it here at Broadway before. It's foundational to what we do. This is a bridge in Honduras. This bridge, good bridge, solid bridge, it was built decades ago, but what happened was a hurricane swept through Honduras. And as you can see, the hurricane radically changed things. Now, that's an excellent bridge. The bridge survived. It's a solid bridge. It's a good bridge. There's only one problem with that bridge. The river moved. That bridge is how we used to do church. That river is our culture. There's nothing wrong with how we used to do church. It worked well. My father went over that bridge, and his father before him, and his father before him. That bridge was a solid bridge. It was a good bridge. How dare you trash that bridge? I'm not trashing the bridge. Nothing wrong with the bridge. The problem is the river moved. Our culture has changed. We need to adjust how we do church, how we present the gospel. Because our culture has changed. We need to build a new bridge. That's what I shared with the leadership of Broadway Church 15 years ago. That's what I pledged we would do, and that's what we have done and continue to do. Folks, this is our reality. This is our city. This is our community. This is our calling. This is our challenge. This is our mission. I've heard it quoted, I've not seen the proof of the statistics, but I've heard it quoted for a long time now that Vancouver is the single most unchurched, most secular city in North America. Think about that. I remember about a decade ago, the National Post did an article on Broadway Church. And in the article, they asked us, they said, so how is it that Broadway Church, in the center of a neighborhood where over half the people, and this reporter had done the research, over half the people in your neighborhood checked off atheists, no religion, how is it that your church is growing in the midst of that? How is that happening? This is a secular city. So what's the secret? Folks, we've adjusted our philosophy. You've heard me say before. So our challenge is this. Let me put it this way. The philosophy that I use, the word picture that I use with our staff is this. On a Sunday, when I stand here, I picture myself like Jesus at the Sermon on the Mount. On the Sermon on the Mount, in front of Jesus, and by the way, if you come with me to Israel, we will stand where the Sermon on the Mount took place. How can you not come to Israel with me? You'd be a fool to not come. But I mean that in the most godly way. But standing there, Jesus at the Sermon on the Mount, in front of him is a crowd of thousands of people. And in that crowd, you had, right in front of him, you had the keeners, the apostles, the disciples. And then you had over here, you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees over here because they didn't get along. And then you had in the middle the average Jewish farmer and household, children and fishermen. And then at the very back, you'd have the Roman soldiers back there. You had this whole group of people in front of him. And that's what we face every Sunday. As I stand on this platform or at any of our campuses, I'm completely aware that in any given service, I have everyone from people who have known Jesus for decades and know the Bible better than I do, to people, this is their very first Sunday ever in a church. And they have no idea who Jesus is. And then we have everything in between. And I'm given a half hour to speak into their lives something that God can use to change them, to bring them closer to being centered in Jesus. And so we can't just stand here. So that's why you don't hear us say, and then we have the story of Noah. We all know Noah. No. Who's the lamb? Haunts me. That's why we'll always say as a team. And the Apostle Paul said, Paul was a leader in the first century church. Sometimes you wonder, why are they explaining this? We're explaining this because the person behind you, this is the first time they've ever been in church. That's why. Because they matter to God. And because I've got one shot, we have one shot at communicating to them that there's something here for them. Every Sunday, well, let me put it this way. You have a friend, a loved one that you've been praying for, praying that they would come to know Jesus, and you've been inviting them to church, and they never come, and one Sunday they come. How do you feel that Sunday? I'll tell you how you feel. You're thinking, oh my goodness, Paulo better be good this Sunday. They better have, I hope the good band's there, which is every week now. And, oh man, I hope the preacher's good. It better not be boring. The jokes better not be stupid. And I hope that friendly usher's on the door. I'm going to make sure I go to that one door where there's the friendly usher, not that other door where they just ignore you. You've got it all worked out in your mind. Oh, this better be good. Suddenly, everything that happens in the service, you're keenly aware of. Why? Because this is the one Sunday they came. Folks, that is every Sunday at Broadway Church. You need to know. I feel that weight every time we gather. knowing you've prayed for people, knowing God's been working in people's lives, and I've got one shot of communicating to them in a way that they'll hear that they're loved and that this is relevant to their lives and that the Bible has something to say to them. I've got one shot to either change how they thought about church or reinforce what they thought about church. It's irrelevant, stupid, it's meaningless, or there's something here. So that's Sundays. But then you say, but what about us who've known Jesus for many years, and we need to go deep in the Word of God? You're absolutely right. And so that's why we have our midweek courses and our Bible classes as well. Because, again, the philosophy of ministry with Jesus. Jesus on that Sermon on the Mount, read the Sermon on the Mount. It's very creative and illustrative, lots of illustrations. But then what would happen is, people would come up to him afterwards, some would, thousands would walk away, but a few of them would come up to him afterwards and said, when you talked about seeds and sowers, what does that mean? And then Jesus would unpack it even more. That's the philosophy we use. So we preach on Sundays in a way that can give something to everybody in that spectrum, and then our midweek courses and our Bible classes on Sundays as well is designed for people who come up, who approach afterwards and say, I want to know more. You have to own your own discipleship. People have to own their own discipleship. And they say, I want to know more. Tell me more. And so we have classes and courses for people, meeting them at their point of need. Now here's the thing, folks. We have a mission. What I'm wanting to say in all this is your ministry matters. Staying true to our philosophy of ministry matters. Consistency matters. Excellence matters. We can never take a day off, because that one day when you really don't care or you're late, you don't show up, or you don't show up on time, or you're not attentive to what your calling or your responsibility is, that's the day that unsaved person, that first time walks in and their experience is less than it could be, less than it should be. You're a link in a chain. Consistency matters. Don't ever believe the lie that what you do in your area of ministry doesn't matter. Everyone matters. Every ministry matters. Understand this. 90% of the people have already made up their mind whether or not they're going to come back to Broadway before I ever say a word on this platform. Their experience from the parking lot, into the building, at Timber, up the stairs, in the hallways, at the door, their experience of how clean the building is, how people treat them, whether people look them in the eye, whether they're welcome. They've already decided, the experience of the worship service, they've already decided whether or not they're going to listen to me. I could spin plaints and dance, and they wouldn't listen because of everything else that's already happened in the first half hour, 40 minutes of their experience. We either work together or we work against each other. You're a link in a chain. You either fulfill your role and I fulfill my role, and we strengthen and further what God is doing in a person's life, or we fail to fulfill our roles and we break the chain and we work against what God is doing in that person's life. This matters. Broadway, we have a mission, we have a vision. We believe every person was created to experience and express the purest love imaginable. I want to read something, and then with this I'm about to close. Several years ago, I was sitting in my office, and I thought to myself, if I could start all over again, if I could plant a church somewhere and just design it, what would be the church of my dreams? What would that look like? And so I sat down at my desk and I penned what I called the church of my dreams. I then shared it with our board, and the board said, that's our dream too. And so we changed it to the church of our dreams. And it's become a template. You can, if you go on YouTube, just Google in Church of My Dreams and you can see it. But let me read it to you right now, and then I want to read a letter. I said, we dream of a church where worship is vibrant, the passionate, heartfelt expression of praise, thanksgiving, reverence, and adoration. We dream of a church where worship needs neither to be coaxed nor coached, for it is ever present, easily accessed, and merely waiting for an opportunity to be expressed. We dream of a church where worship is like fresh pools of water that are gathered on the surface, flowing from a pure well sourced from depths below. We dream of a church that is filled with people who determine what they should do for others based upon what Jesus Christ has done for them. We dream of a church that meets needs, not just budgets, that repairs lives, not just buildings. We dream of a church that is large enough to impact an entire city because it's small enough to care for a single soul. We dream of a church that meets people where they are and equips them to become what they were created to be. We dream of a church that believes what Jesus believes, teaches what Jesus taught, lives like Jesus lived, and loves like Jesus loves. We dream of a church where people are intentionally reaching back, encouraging those who are steps behind them in their journey. We dream of a church whose love for God is expressed and experienced through their love for one another. We dream of a church that is so selfless, so loving, and so united that it can tangibly be felt. Remember this line. That it can be tangibly be felt and experienced by all who walk through the doors. We dream of a church where friends are found, bonds are formed, and promises are kept. We dream of a church that puts the needs of the lost ahead of the preferences of the found. We dream of a church that is always changing its methods and never changing its message. We dream of a church whose people both go and bring, invade and invite, so that others may hear and know the good news. That's the church of our dreams. This week, I was sent an email from one of our leaders. An email that they had received from a friend of theirs. And I was given permission, they were given permission to share this with me. I'm not going to mention any names. But this leader in our church, many years ago, had invited this friend to come to Broadway. And they came decades ago. And then they hadn't come after that. And then they recently came a few months ago. And they've been attending ever since. And they wrote this to their friend at Broadway. An excerpt from their email. Earlier this year, I decided to attend Broadway for the first time in 32 years. Upon entering the church on that Sunday for the service, I immediately felt the presence that I hadn't felt anywhere else. I felt a peace that's hard to describe. I subsequently began attending Broadway regularly, and I knew that I had found my new home. At times during the services, I am so overwhelmed with emotion that it's hard to compose myself. On one Sunday, the tears began flowing as I walked into the building, and they continued through the service and throughout the day. Never in my life have I felt as loved as I did that day. I never thought that I was worthy of such love. I never thought that I deserved such love. But within the four walls, I felt God's overwhelming love. How and why would God love me? What did I ever do to receive such love? The tears, the emotion was and is profound. Attending Broadway, I feel a strength, a presence, a love unlike anything else in my life before. Broadway Church, we have a mission. We have a vision. We have a calling. We are called by God to do all that we can to communicate the message in a way that people can understand and experience it, to lead people to Christ-centered living by word, by deed, and by the Spirit of God. So I wanted to begin today by just revisiting that root, that core, that foundation of why we do things the way that we do them here. I want you to walk out of this session realizing and remembering the reasoning behind much of what we do here. And I hope that this reminder will help to inspire and inform you in your area of ministry from this day forward.